Okay.
Okay, good afternoon. It's nice to see you all. This is the last film for this series of Real Jewish Classics. Like any good movie, we're hoping to have a sequel. So we're planning to do another series of 8 coming up starting mid-January, I think. Which means, by the way, if anyone has any favorite Jewish films that you want to shout out to me, send me an email or text or whatever, and I'm open for a few suggestions, though I won't guarantee them. So because some of it depends, of course, on availability and those kinds of things, but we also have other opportunities for when we can see movies with Jewish content. Besides class like this, we also have our Jewish movie group, which tries to do a monthly thing. So we may have other opportunities to see movies that you suggest as well. So, um, so I think probably a few of you are asking yourself, why did I put this movie on this same list with everything else? It's Jewish content is a lot less explicit than the Jewish content of just about everything else we saw, and I'm going to give you a few reasons why I did it. Uh, One part is that I like it. I like this movie. So I don't really like showing movies that I don't like. So that's one reason that I picked it. I also, as we did all of these movies, really we saw 8 movies, but I really think of them as 4 pairs of 2. Things came together in pairs, if you think about it, right? We did the musicals Yentl and Fiddler. You can think about that as a pair. We did the 2 comedies from with the Holocaust themes in them, To Be or Not to Be, and The Great Dictator, right? So in a sense, I think of this movie Running on Empty as being a companion piece to the one we saw last week, Daniel. They happen to be directed by the same director, Sidney Lumet, who, as I mentioned last week, has made a lot of movies with more or less explicit content. But I think that there are some parallels here, of course, between the story of Daniel and the story that we see here in Running on Empty. They are both have some basis in real stories. We talked a lot about the Rosenbergs last week, which certainly, in a sense, almost sidetracks that movie because you can't really talk about um, the character of Daniel and really what I think is Sidney Lumet's main concern in that movie is how what happens to his parents affect Daniel and his sister, right? So, and I think in some ways you have the same kind of theme here. How what the popes did when they were younger and what forced them to go on the road. The movie is really about how this affects their children, and most particularly, of course, the older son, right? Danny, uh, played here by River Phoenix. So, so that's part of my thinking. I also I just want to make a case that a lot of the movies that we saw, like Gentleman's Agreement, for example, and of course we paralleled that one with Crossfire, the 2 earliest movies to talk about anti-Semitism. uh, um, the Jewish characters in those movies are explicitly Jewish, and their reason for existing in the movie is the fact that they're Jewish. And I think that we have a shift in the way America looks at itself and the way American Jews look at themselves by the time this movie gets made in the late 1980s, right? Which is that characters in this movie are Jewish, but they just happen to be Jewish. They just happen to be characters in a movie who are Jewish, right? And that's kind of an interesting shift in storytelling, right? That we no longer have to tell a story about Jews because they're Jews, right? So it just happens that that this is a Jewish family in a certain sense, and so that you get very little that's explicitly Jewish in it. I think for Jews watching Judd Hirsch's character, it's easy to assume that his character is Jewish. I mean, the actor, of course, is Jewish as well, but the way he occasionally puts on an old world accent, imitating his parents and things like that, um, may feel Jewish to us in a sense, right? I mean, some of the way he speaks, and yet his character, I would say, is not stereotypically Jewish. Right? He's not the little nebbishy Woody Allen kind of stereotype, right? It's rather different from that. So I think that makes this portrayal interesting, right? Nor is he, um, as so often is the case with Jewish characters in movies, he's not the attorney, or as he was, Judd Hirsch himself actually got an Oscar nomination a few years before this movie for portraying the psychiatrist in Ordinary People, right? Which is a more sort of stereotypically Jewish role, right? Um, and is particularly played in that movie in a sense in opposition to the very buttoned up, non-emotional family of Ordinary People. The feeling psychiatrist, right, is perhaps a bit of a stereotyped role. So here he's decidedly working class, maybe not by choice, but that's what he does. He works in the back of kitchens and stuff like that, picking up jobs wherever they go. He can work on his car. There are things like that are not sort of part of the stereotypical Jewish character in movies. So I think that makes it interesting as well. Uh, so I said this story in some ways is probably based on a kind of a composite of a few things that happened during protests for the Vietnam War. I think a couple of them you might be pretty familiar with. I mean, the bombing of the math building at the University of Wisconsin, where it wasn't a janitor who was maimed, but it was a young graduate student working late at night who wasn't expected to be in the building, who actually was killed in that bombing, and and so folks who were protesting the war ended up being sentenced and serving time in prison for, I believe, for manslaughter as a result of that particular bombing. It also, in some ways, maybe parallels some of the stories about Abbie Hoffman, not the Chicago 7 part of the story, but later on in Abbie Hoffman's life, he was arrested for, I think it was conspiracy to sell cocaine, and he went underground, changed his name, and actually had plastic surgery to avoid capture. Went under the name of Barry Freed for several years, and actually continued to live the life of an activist. He did a whole bunch of things as Barry Freed, protesting nuclear power and things like that. And then eventually, right before this movie was made, so probably maybe a catalyst to the development of the movie, he turned himself in, spent a relatively short time in prison, and actually then committed suicide not long after this movie came out. So kind of a composite of perhaps those stories give us the story of the Pope family here. Pope shortened from Popov. We only hear that once in the movie when Judd Hirsch gets drunk. He comes home singing "Pretty Woman" by Roy Orbison, and starts talking about who he really is and his name, and how his father changed it from Popov to Pope. Right. The most explicitly Jewish thing in the movie is, well, there's two things I'd point to. One is, yeah, I talked a lot about New York and Sidney Lumet last week. There are only a couple of scenes that take place in the city of New York in this movie. The movie mostly takes place supposedly in someplace in New Jersey. And which was close enough to New York for Lumet. He didn't mind going as far as New York to film a few shots. And they did some exteriors, you may have noticed, in Florida at the beginning of the movie, there's some palm trees in the background. And again, the Florida is sort of an extension of New York for a lot of Jews. So, you know, so that kind of worked for him. But the interiors of this movie are almost entirely shot in New York City in a studio. I think maybe on Long Island, actually. But so sort of typical for Sidney Lumet, he didn't like to go far from home when he was making movies. And but again, doesn't really show a New York filled with the landmarks that you recognize, you know. But there's one scene that's actually very familiar to me. So when they have to run from Florida near the beginning of the movie, and he meets with his contact, an African American woman who tells him that his mother died. If you remember that scene, I don't know if anybody recognized where they're standing. You know, some of our confirmation students might actually, because the street they're standing on is actually Eldridge Street on the Lower East Side of New York City. The building they're standing in front of is the Eldridge Street Synagogue. In 1987, the Eldridge Street Synagogue was just beginning what ended up being about a 25-year renovation project. So in 1987, it was almost literally a rat's nest. It was. I was a rabbinic student in New York in 1987, and was among. Yeah, so you only see it in the movie. Kind of, you see the first floor. They're standing in front of those wrought iron gates. There's a sign in English and Chinese, no parking. And there's an elderly man in a kippah on what would be the right-hand door there, sweeping up, right? And he may well have been one of the actual members of the Minyan, because at that time in the 1980s, the entire upper floors of the Eldridge Street Synagogue had been closed for years, and only the basement level was being used by a minyan of elderly Orthodox Jews who came in. And when I was a rabbinic student in New York, some of us took turns being the 10th man for their minyan, actually. So I had some experience doing that. It was also when they were first started to think about the possibility of renovating the building. It's still a working Orthodox minyan, but it's also a museum. And they were just starting to talk about that and starting to raise money to renovate the building. So in 1987 and early 88, they had some cleanup days in the sanctuary. And so the sanctuary was open for the first time since the 1950s, I think. And so we went in there, and the windows had mostly fallen in and been decayed. There was, you know, the plaster had come off the walls. I mean, it was an unbelievable mess. And I was among a number, probably hundreds of volunteers over the course of those first couple of years, who came in to clean up the mess and sift through the stuff we were cleaning to find the little pieces of the glass, stained glass windows that had fallen in, and so they could be kept for the renovation. So as I said, it took about 25 years. Anyway, so it was hardly a landmark of New York City when Sidney Lumet uses it in this movie. But I think it's nonetheless interesting that it's a little nod to the Lower East Side and the Jewish heritage of the Lower East Side, that he chose that particular spot on Eldridge Street to do this. It also leads to what's really the most explicitly Jewish moment in the movie, which is in bed that night when Arthur tells his wife that his mother has died, right? And Sophie is her name. So he comes back and tells her that Sophie's dead and that she never let on. She never told him. And I don't know if I have this quote exact, but it's pretty close. A little bit of a soliloquy, I guess, speaking to his wife. I can see her standing with Morris, two fat old Jews, ex-Bolsheviks, talking to their red diaper baby on the phone from a laundromat. He goes on a little bit about how she loved him, that she flew to Chicago on a moment's notice in a blizzard, how she hated to fly. I told her, I wish it was easy. And she said, you, you wish it were easier. You wish it were easier, right? She corrected my grammar like one of the kids she teaches. So, um, so that's probably, I think, undoubtedly the most explicitly Jewish reference in the movie that he talks about his parents, and so we know something about them, that they're ex-Bolsheviks, right? They would have been the sort of people who were hanging around with the people we watched in last week's movies in the flashback, right? And again, so you see some of these parallels and some of the things that Lumet was sort of interested in both these movies, of kind of connecting the old left and the new left, right? So I think that's pretty fascinating. So this movie was nominated for 2 Oscars, one for its screenplay, which is written by a woman named Naomi Foner. She has a long list of credits in Hollywood, although she might be best known these days because of her children. Her children are Jake and Maggie Gyllenhaal. So, and in several of their movies, she gets credits, in the end of movies, especially earlier in their careers, a thank you to her in the credits. So they're certainly more famous than she was. She did not win the Oscar. That was the year that Rain Man came out and won the Oscar for best screenplay, among other things. The other nomination that this movie got was for Best Supporting Actor for River Phoenix. To suggest a couple of things happened there. One is that's probably the wrong category. I mean, if you really think about who's the supporting actor in this movie and who's the star, I would argue that River Phoenix is the main character in this movie, and that his father is the supporting role, right? But these things are rather political out in Hollywood. I think it's fairly likely that the studio, Warner Brothers, put him up as best supporting actor because everyone knew Dustin Hoffman was going to win that year, right? So rather than put him in the same category as Dustin Hoffman playing Raymond in Rain Man, they may have suggested him for another category where he might have had more of a chance. Also, because these things are relatively political. He was only about 20 years old, River Phoenix, and though he'd already had several good roles to his credit, including Stand By Me, if you remember that film about 4 boys, and The Mosquito Coast, and a few other things that he'd been in already. There was probably, as is sometimes thought in Hollywood, well, he'll be around, he'll get his turn to get his Oscar. Unfortunately, of course, he died of a drug overdose at 23. So he did not have that opportunity to win an Oscar later in life. The Oscar for Best Supporting Actor went to Kevin Kline that year for A Fish Called Wanda, a movie which I'm not sure holds up as well as this one does. If you watch it again now, I mean, the jokes they make about stuttering in A Fish Called Wanda, I mean, make it for me nearly unwatchable at this point. But so it's interesting. So River Phoenix becomes one of the 17 different actors that Sidney Lumet directs to an Oscar-nominated performance. So he certainly had a way with actors, and I think the other actors in the film do quite well also. Christine Lahti was nominated for Golden Globe and won actually the Los Angeles Film Critics Association Award for Best Actress for this movie, but did not get an Oscar nomination. I mean, there were several other strong performances during the course of that year. And I think it also, makes it difficult if if River Phoenix's role is the supporting role, then what does that make her? So is she a best actress or a best supporting actress? I think she may have fallen between the cracks a little bit. So, but she's quite good in this. Um, and I think Judd Hirsch does well by himself for himself as well. This movie, I mean, it's he of course was very well honored in his career with Emmys for his role in the TV series Taxi. He won a Tony for his appearance. I think he was nominated more than once for a Tony. I think he won for I'm Not Rappaport on Broadway. So if memory serves. Um, so similar to last week, we were talking about the way Sidney Lumet uses sound and soundtracks. I don't know if you noticed the bird song in this movie. There's a lot of bird song in this movie, which I think is deliberate. This maybe harkens back to we saw a lot of birds in Yentl, right? There's a certain freedom that birds have that people who are living underground and have to move every few months don't have. So I think that may be a deliberate thing there. There is not much soundtrack in this movie. There's a little more than there was in Daniel. There's some solo piano that appears here and there in the movie, under the credits at the beginning and the end. Uh, one or two scenes during the movie, the piano comes back. I think plausibly you could say that the piano music is actually going on in um, uh, the head of the character, but it's I think about this character of Danny Pope, who's uh, playing piano mostly on a keyboard, uh, without sound. Sometimes with headphones on, sometimes we don't hear the sound at all. The idea that there's a sound of music in his head is, I think, perhaps something to think about. Other times, the music is very clearly motivated by what's going on screen. For instance, in the first music class that he has when he gets to his new high school, and they play a little bit of a Madonna song followed by a little bit of Beethoven, right? Or the tryouts at Juilliard, or at the birthday party for his mom, where as they're cleaning up, they turn on a cassette of James Taylor singing "Fire and Rain," which becomes, I think, a highly symbolic moment, which gets a callback at the end of the movie too, right? So the family singing along to "Fire and Rain," dancing, doing the dishes, and then at the end, after the final scene, that piano music kind of melts into uh, Fire and Rain, but not the recording of James Taylor, but the family singing along with James Taylor, right? So that even though they've left Danny on the side of the road, so to speak, much like they do with the family dog near the beginning of the movie, right? You know, uh, the the family is not completely disintegrated because of that moment of singing "Fire and Rain" at the end, right? Uh, we're left with the idea that um, they will see each other again, right? Difficult as that might be. The other times music appears, you've got the chamber music concerts, things like that. So the music is actually a part of the movie, not superimposed over it, with some rare exceptions. And I think that use of sound. There's even a moment during that particular concert where Danny is outside, so you can hear a little bit of the music bleeding from inside the house to outside, but the more dominant sound is the sound of the singing birds outside. So I think these are the sorts of things that a director pays attention to, and I think that Sidney Lumet is paying attention to this stuff throughout. It's a slightly smaller canvas than Daniel, but you still have since in all of Sidney Lumet's films, really the most popular ones, the less popular ones, uh, the casts are not large. The number of speaking parts, the number of people who have more than a sentence or two to say are very, very small. You can certainly count them on two hands. Um, and in terms of serious speaking parts, you can count it on one hand, right? So, um, so you have the four members of the Pope family themselves, the girlfriend, the father of the girlfriend, and then you can throw in a couple of others who are actually quite important in some ways. I mean, I think when Christine Lottie's character goes to meet her father, that's a very moving scene, I think. And the father has a very small part, really. That's it. I mean, that's his only scene in the movie, and very little dialogue, is very communicative. And it's, again, I think, an example of the way Sidney Lumet worked, that, as we talked about last week, rehearsing movies as if they were plays for a number of weeks before actually putting them on film. And then once he puts them on film, doing it very quickly, as he did back in his television directing days. It makes for a very thought through performance, and a very spontaneous looking performance, which I think is very powerful. If I could just throw in a couple of other little details that they think are interesting. I mean, watching the awkwardness that River Phoenix brings to this role physically is quite interesting to watch. The moment, if you just watched the first few minutes of this movie again and saw the way, as he plays baseball, he fumbles with his glasses. And then again, in the next scene where he throws his bicycle into the bushes and loses his glasses again. I mean, it's this, maybe it just happened, right? But he stays in character for that stuff and gives a kind of a sense of a boy growing into himself, and not quite sure what to do with himself, with his body, what to do with himself physically. And you see that played out over and over throughout the movie in many highly evocative ways, I think. So I think there's a lot to like about this movie. I'm curious to hear what you think, and want to compare it a little bit to what we saw last week. So this similar story in terms of its focus on the effect of parents' choices on their children. And you wonder, how might Daniel's story have been different had his parents lived or gone underground or served a term in prison or whatever? What effect would that have had, rather than the effect it seems to have had on his and his sister's life? What effect will this have on Danny's later life? These are some of the questions that the movie wants us to ask, I think. So.
Okay, Shoshana, you need to unmute.
Yeah, there are two points that I wanted to make. One of them, the way I see it, the only Jewish person in this movie was Judd Hirsch. He mentioned his Bolshevik parents.
Yes.
The other one, his wife, she was a daughter to well-to-do, a head of some AT&T, I don't know, some major company.
Yeah.
And probably unlikely, and I think a name, and you saw them in the newspapers, and they are unlikely to be Jewish. And there was nothing in their practice that said that they were doing anything about that. So this is just a minor point, but I thought the only Jewish person was Judd Hirsch.
But I think that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure. The movie doesn't explicitly tell us one way or the other, that's for sure. But I think it's worth thinking about that. We might be looking at two different kinds of Jewish experience here. Right? That we're looking at the ex-Bolshevik Jewish experience on his side, and the Upper East Side, Jewish experience, of built generational wealth on her side. So it's not impossible that they're both Jews, but it's almost like an intermarriage, even if they are.
Anyway, the other point that I wanted to mention, this is true, the emphasis on the impact on the kids. But I think that this movie also shows the impact of this rebellion against Vietnam and by mistake hurting somebody. This is why they had to run away. But all this trying to escape all the time had effect not only on the kids. On the kids, it was the more obvious, but also on themselves. Yes. Because they were highly intelligent people that threw away their opportunities, and their impact on the parents. She had a meeting with the father. I cried throughout that meeting. Yeah. And he told her, do you know how it feels? I didn't see my child for 14 years. Right. And anyway, that whole scene was so touching. Yeah. And so I think they did try to show the impact on your family. Right.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm glad you said that. I mean, I cry in that scene too. You know, I think that's, and again, I think it is one of the powerful things about this movie is that there are scenes like that in it that make you feel that way. I mean, I think the scene and there's a certain amount of, there's certainly a little more humor in this movie. There are some funny lines and some cute things that happen than we saw in Daniel, which was kind of relentless in some ways. But the scene where River Phoenix delivers a pizza to his grandmother's house, right? And just to get a look at her, you know, is very touching in its own way. Right. And well, you have to pay for that. And he says, no, I'll have to eat it, you know, which is funny, you know, but the scene is very touching as well. So, yeah, it certainly is about how it affects all of them. I point out, you know, it's easy to forget these things, but in the early 1970s in America, there were roughly 2,000 bombings a year, right? You know, 1970, 71, 72. In protest of the Vietnam War, primarily, also some related to racism and things like that. So you certainly had bombings that were carried out by racists, like you did starting in the early 60s, you know, with church bombings and things like that. But you also, of course, had the Weather Underground, and you had Black Panthers, and you know, so there were literally thousands of bombings in America in the early 1970s. So this is just one of them, and it happens to go a little bit awry. And because, you know, somebody was there who was not expected to be there, it puts this whole chain of things into motion. So I think that's it's worth thinking about how sort of commonplace that was back then, right? And one of the differences between this and Daniel, it seems to me, is this kind of established network through the underground, you know, to hide and protect them for years. So,
Rabbi, Carol has a comment. Carol, go ahead.
Hi. You know, at the beginning of the movie, I like this movie a lot. I don't remember seeing it, although Alan tells me I did. At the beginning, when Harry runs into the house, and comes running out with this board, you know, I really wondered what that was all about. I couldn't figure out why he would run into the house. That board, I think, was so interesting how they took it with them all the way through to other different venues and what that represented with the music. And then when Christine Lottie is talking to her father, the father even says, do you still have that board, you know, synthesizer, or what? It's not really a synthesizer because keyboard. And I just thought that was so interesting, the connection between the father, the daughter, and the grandson, and continuing on with that music.
You can, there's one scene where River Phoenix is playing it. I think he's sitting on a bed, and you can actually see that there's still like something stuck on it. It says, to Annie, right?
Oh.
So the suggestion perhaps that the father gave it to his daughter as a gift, and she's held on to it all these years, and that And you, of course, the question is, how did he get to be so good at playing the piano?
Right.
And the answer we find when she comes in and finds him in the music room and sits down next to him and starts playing next to him. So the question of who he's been studying with to learn how to play piano is his mother.
Right.
You
Right.
know,
That was also a very moving scene.
yeah,
Didn't need words, and it showed the close connection between the mother and son.
right. Yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful family relationships.
Right. Yeah, I think so. Um and there are times when they feel like a real family to me, right? Which is the key to and maybe especially in the silliness. I mean, the little brother who doesn't seem to have many other acting credits. He had a couple before that, but doesn't seem to have gone on to be an actor after this. But the scene at the dinner table where he puts the giant safety pin in his nose, is talking about the kid in his class who knows all the train schedules. His father says, "Get to know that kid. That's important to know." And says, finally says something to him like, "What's with the safety pin?" He says, "What safety pin?" Right? It feels like something that could happen around my family table, right? So, so there are moments like that that really hit the nail on the head, I think, for family. Right?
I was just also going to say that when Danny seems to be willing to go along with all of the struggles of the parents until he develops a relationship with Martha Plimpton, and then he's really in a quandary about, does he go with them or does he move on? And he wants to move on with his life and go to Juilliard. But there's a lot of complications, but it's great that the parents allowed him to do that.
Right. And it is. And there's a couple of scenes where they try to, where the movie tries to explain some of this. Mom's saying, I never even allowed myself to think about this, right? That there would be a time when these boys would grow up and, of course, they can't stay just the four of them together forever, right? And the father's saying, we just have to take this one day, 1 hour at a time, right? And that's what we're going to do. And so I think that helps us understand how they've made some of the choices that they've made up till this point. But you're right, you get to this point where, Danny is now a man in many different ways. So things have to be different. There's a scene between the parents. I don't have the exact quote again here, but when they're telling you she's worried about what this lifestyle has done to the kids, and he says, just look at them. Just look at those kids. Beautiful, bright, caring. How badly could we have done? And there's something quite moving about that in fact they have raised a remarkable kid, right? Talented, compassionate. Some of the things that they did and perhaps were forced to do because of the situation they were in, but also some of the things that they did because that was perhaps in their political nature to do. Birthday presents have to be found or made. That's quite a nice idea in some ways, whether it comes from they're having to be on the lam all the time, or whether it comes from a kind of a dedicated intention not to participate in a consumerist culture, right? Either way, it works, right? These kids. And then, of course, at the end, the final straw, I think, for Arthur that causes him to have a change of heart about, we've got to do something, is when he hears the news on the radio in that last scene that Gus has been killed after this bank robbery, and it gives him perhaps a sense of the finality of what has to come, right? And so so that becomes the final sort of catalyst for letting Danny go. This is but what he says to him besides that we will see each other again, right? He says, go out there and make a difference. He says, your mother and I tried, and don't let anybody tell you any different. Right? And so it's again sort of a passing a baton, right? Go and do it your way, but go make a difference. Go make a difference in the world. And that's when the movie goes back into the song Fire and Rain, the solo piano into Fire and Rain. And for me, the line stands out, but I always thought that I'd see you again. Kind of stands out there in that moment. So. Other comments, other things people saw or conjecture that you might have? How's he going to do? And going to call his grandfather, go to Juilliard. His girlfriend also wants to go to New York and become a writer. Maybe she became a writer and she wrote this movie. Who knows? What do you think?
Susan, go ahead. You have to unmute. And then I have a question, Rabbi.
Yeah.
I think he will go to Juilliard. I think his grandfather's connections will help him, skip a lot of the hurdles, the fact that there are no real records behind him. Because if you noticed, when he was auditioning, he picked up a pamphlet in which his grandmother had funded that whole thing where they were able to audition and do all those things. So I think he will do just fine.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, that would seem like a total contradiction of what he's been raised with, though, right? That his grandparents can pull some strings and get him into Juilliard, but could happen. I think you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think even they were a very devoted family, but the running was so difficult.
Yeah. The piece he plays for his Juilliard audition, by the way, is a Mozart piece, but it's slowed down to about half tempo. I'm not sure if I've got this right. I think it was a Fantasia. I think it's called a Fantasia in C minor, maybe. It's definitely in a minor key. And so, it's a little far-fetched to go there, but, by picking something in a minor key and slowing it down, there's a particular kind of ethos that the director wants to evoke there, right?
I also thought that you can't help but compare it to today. And if somebody came to a school and said, I don't have the records, it would be like, well, let me email, let me, whatever. And, and there's nothing to discuss about that, but who has that type of ideology to go on the run?
Yeah.
Who would forgo all of their material possessions?
Right.
And just, Gus says to her, you're living, this middle-class life, but they're in some house that I don't know, however they got there.
It's rented, it's a rental.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And it speaks to its time quite a bit. Right. It predates cell phones and all these things, right? It's a lot harder to be off the grid now than it was then, right? How do you just disappear? So
But there are thousands of people in witness protection programs.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah. So, but that, but that's so hard to do today, right? And there are the other sorts of things that are just sort of part of the, we still understand because of the age we are. But for instance, after his Juilliard audition, he stops. We don't even really see it. There's just a quick glance. There's a phone book hanging from a phone booth. That's how he gets his grandmother's address to go bring the pizza, right? I don't know, when was the last time you saw a phone book, right? Or used one, or saw one hanging at a phone booth somewhere, right?
What's a phone booth?
Yeah, right. It was, it was a part of everyday life in 1987,
And the off the grid thing, my son went away this weekend. He didn't tell me, but I see that I have a Netflix sign in from Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And then I had a second Netflix sign and I'm like, hey buddy, are you in Wisconsin?
Yeah.
And so it's so insidious in our life of you can track people's iPhones. I mean, I
Right.
think it would be way harder today to go off the grid.
I think people do, you know, and, um, you know, but you're right. It's a lot harder. It's, you know, of course, the movie takes some of this into account even then. I mean, when she goes to visit the dentist, and he says, every time I see you, I feel guilty because you're still doing what, you know, you still have those ideals that I gave up, right? To join the establishment, you know, and that's an interesting aspect of this as well, right? And something that I think young people are wrestling with all over again in our society, right? So. Other thoughts or comments on this one?
Susan, go ahead. You have to unmute.
I think the main fear of the parents were that they would have to go to prison, and they felt they would get at least 15 years.
Right.
I think that's why they were so off the grid.
Yeah.
I think that's their main fear. And they would go to small towns. They would live in very shoddy circumstances. Everything was done in cash. So they were able to do it. It was pathetic.
Yeah. Yeah. And so certainly they feared prison and that sort of thing. But what they fear most about prison, I think, is about not seeing their children, right? The same thing that they were forced to do in a certain way to live the way they are and not see their own parents, you know, is what they don't want to see repeated in their generation. So they're willing to do anything to keep the four of them together, right? You know, and of course the idea that if they both end up in prison, you know, think back to Daniel last week. I mean, where did those kids go, right? So not necessarily, you don't have much control over that once that happens.
Meredith and then Shoshana. Meredith, go ahead.
I was going to say, I
Carol,
think there's an underlying, I think there's an underlying theme in both these films that's a very biblical theme. The sins of the parents are visited on the children.
Yeah. 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 So I think that's definitely there, right? I mean, I guess the argument might be whether we consider those things sins. I'm not sure that Sidney Lumet thought that either of these characters were sinful. They were true believers, right? And in some ways, this movie takes for granted that the kind of behavior they engaged in was right. They just had the misfortune of there being somebody present in the building who wasn't expected to be there, right? But that the destruction of property to sort of bring the war home was what people were thinking about in those days, and they didn't necessarily think about it the way we might think about it now. But at the time, they certainly thought about it as, you know, the amount of death and destruction that the United States was dealing out in Southeast Asia. The only way to change the tide of that was to make people feel it here, right? So, you know, so that's what they had in mind. So I'm not sure that you know, that Lumet, you know, would think of those things as being the sins of the parents. I'm not sure that the movie wants us to think about them that way. I think it wants us to sympathize with them. They just had some bad luck in what.
But certainly the behaviors of the parents and for all of us affect children.
Right. So there's no doubt about that what our parents do shape us, right? And our experience has a lot to do with what they do and their experience. So
Right. We have Shoshana and then Ellen. And then Ellen, you'll have to unmute. Shoshana, go ahead.
Now, she said that they were really remorseful and they were still running ahead because they didn't want to go to jail and the children will be on their own, or who knows what will happen to them. She said that she was going to give herself up when the second child is bigger. So she already announced it. And also, I don't remember, this is really a special period in history. And we also had a personal experience. I don't want to take your time. But if you remember, I forgot the name of that professor from University of Illinois, that he was also, do you remember the story, who it was? And finally he came out running away. He also had kids, and pretty good kids. And he ended up becoming a professor at the University of Illinois. He had the education. The Vietnam period is a special period in terms of this movie. And I don't think there is another one that you can compare.
yeah, no, not exactly. Although I think, I do think the director is trying to make a sense of there are some connections that run from, I mean, what makes Abbie Hoffman such a critic of America in the 1960s? Well, it's the family that Abbie Hoffman came from the 1940s, right? What makes people stand up today? There is a kind of a generational linkage I would say we certainly see it on all sides of the political spectrum, right? That there's a generational linkage, it's more surprising when someone separates from their parents' ideology rather than continues it,
But there was also a period of rebellion. These were well-to-do children that were rebelling against their parents, that they had it too easy and they're going to build a new world.
Right.
We were driving from California to New York, and in a very old car, and we needed somebody that we found by luck in a camping ground. And we found out they were one of those hippie, he was black and she was white, and they were going to their parents to tell them that they got married. And they were not in any hurry because they didn't want to hear what their parents had to say, but they were going there. But they didn't have, but this was the whole idea. You don't have to get up at 9 o'clock in the morning, and you are going to build a new, more equal world and all these dreams. Anyway, but we needed somebody to help to fix the car, and they were able to fix the car. And we decided that we were going more or less in the same direction. We spent 5 days driving in the same direction and meeting and talking, all this philosophical kind of stuff. But we had to feed them. They had all these big ideas how to fix and make a just world. At the end, all of them went to work, because otherwise, how are you going to get bread on your table?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, we have Ellen and then Alice. Ellen, go ahead.
The movie points that out, right? You've got the dentist on the one hand, who has, he still has the same sensibilities and sensitivities he had during the Vietnam War, but he needs to put bread on the table, right? So he goes to dental school. By the way, look, you can read too much into stuff, but as long as we're paralleling these two movies, there are dentists in both of them, right? Mindish in the first one and this dentist. I don't know. How often do dentists show up in the movies? I don't know. You'd have to do a statistical analysis, but it probably didn't hurt. And it may even have been something that, the director said, well, let's not make him a doctor. Let's make him a dentist, right? But of course, he sort of has to be a dentist because she works for a doctor, right? So she needs to have a toothache so she can visit the dentist, right?
Okay, Alice?
I was just thinking about comparing the two movies, not making any judgments, but that the parents really ended up acting very differently. And I'm not saying either of them were good or bad, but I don't remember their names, the Rosenberg characters in the first movie, in the movie Daniel, I mean, they could have, right, couldn't they have like told on some of their compatriots and stuff and not gotten executed, but they chose not to, and what that ended up doing to their kids. Whereas, the Pope family, struggled what to do, but then eventually made a decision to let their son, go off and live his life.
Yeah.
So I think that was, for me, that was very interesting to compare the two families and how they
Right.
worked.
Yeah, good. Thank you. I mean, that's why I paired these two movies.
Yeah.
And-
Great
Yeah.
pairing.
And
I'm
I-
sorry, Ellen. Oh, we have one more comment. Ellen? You have to unmute. Ellen? Okay, try now, Ellen.
Well, okay. Sorry, my iPad wouldn't unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
I thought it was interesting because these were both Sidney Lumet films. The generations are correct that the parents in this movie are the Daniel in the earlier movie.
Right.
They're the children of the Bolsheviks
Mhm.
who eventually become the anti-war protesters of the Vietnam era. And then you see how their running affects their child and children, like the Rosenberg children, the Isaacson children are
Yeah.
affected by their parents' action in the earlier film. But it fits in time, totally generational.
That's right. That's right. So I think that's, Lumet saw this script and said, I have to do it. Right. It's absolutely, there are certain things that Lumet was interested in a lot of his movies: social justice, guilt and responsibility, memory, family lost and family recovered. I mean, these things come up in a lot of his movies. We could do a whole series, especially if I was teaching a film class, not a Jewish film class. If I was a professor today, I'd say, maybe we'll just look at a semester of Sidney Lumet films, right? And see the themes and things and the different ways that they run through his work. It's a pretty fascinating body of work. I want to finish with a last thought here, which is that both of these movies, in some sense, are about the coming of age of boys becoming men, and they're powerful in their own right. Neither of these boys has a traditional bar mitzvah. We can assume that among the popes that this was not a possibility, and that for them to do something that would have been potentially open them up. So Danny has to become an adult in his own way. And the line that kills me from, remember, by the way, this character is named Danny, right? The movie we saw last week was called Daniel. Again, maybe not an accident. But the line that kills me from the movie Daniel is his mother's words in the death house as they're taking her to be executed. And she says, "Let this be Daniel's bar mitzvah." seeing what the state does to his parents. And in some ways, that's what's going on here. What Danny Pope sees of how his parents have had to run for all these years because of their political convictions and a mistake that they made. Right? So anyway, so that's our 8 films for this session. Thank you very much for coming along. I hope you enjoyed it. If nothing else, it may make you go back and see a few more Sidney Lumet films. They're most of them are really, really worthwhile.
Yeah.
So-
Rabbi, Carol set us up for a good segue. What movie will we do January 12th?
I will have Vanessa get back to you with that because my list.
Good
I
answer.
have a list. I haven't decided the order. So, but as I said, if anyone has a suggestion, but I really intend to do the same kind of thing that we'll have 8 movies, 4 sets of parallels. So we'll see. I'm pretty sure there's going to be at least one more Sidney Lumet in there, maybe 2. So we'll see. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's been great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yes.
you.
Happy New
Thank you.
Year.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Be well.
Thanks.
Happy holidays.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Ike.
Thanks.